So I'm going to introduce now our first speaker, Carlton Jama who just came down from New York yesterday, this evening. He's an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, City University of New York. Professor Adams' research interests include Africana identity issues and migration. He recently completed a manuscript for publication entitled Africana People in China, Psychoanalytic Perspectives on Migration Experiences, Identity, and Precarious Employment. This is a topic that has come up already in discussion a few times, so we're very, very glad to have Carlton Jama Adams.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I want to kidnap Susan because the logistics are just flawless. I work at a university where to get a staple machine is a climb of 10 mountains, so this went so well, thank you.
Thank you.
Secondly, I want to thank you as teachers. Everybody here is a high school teacher, is that correct? Middle school and high school. Well, I hallucinated through middle school. And in high school, got ethically slapped around because I went to high school in the Caribbean, and that's a system where you have one examination, one chance, and if you mess it up, that was it. You went and did physical labor for the rest of your life. There was no after school, there was no evening school, there was no makeup. And teachers like, you need to get your act together. And for some reason, I listened, so it made a big, big difference to me. But teachers have been very, very important in my life. So thank you for what you do, despite the challenges. I'd like to think I have lots of interesting things to say, so you have to assertively interrupt. If you've got a question, if I'm talking too fast, if I don't finish a sentence, that's generally the feedback I get from my students. So, okay. I want to start with two vignettes. Renee is a 32-year-old African-American woman from the Midwest. She grew up in Detroit, and this should have been in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s. Very bleak. The schools were bad. Her family network was weak, except for her grandmother. They cared about her, but the intellectual resources necessary to get ahead, the connections, the job contacts, very, very weak on that. And the outcome was oftentimes premature impregnation, incarceration. If you know anything about the armed forces, from around the 80s, it wasn't a place that rescued people anymore. You could just send your kid off, and a couple of things happened. The African American community realized during the Vietnam War that a disproportionate amount of its kids were going there and not coming back. And then secondly, people said, no, you can do better than this. So there wasn't much escape if you weren't educated. Fortunately for her, her grandmother was the mythical, strong grandmother. You will stay in school, you will do well, you will progress. You will not be like your mother who had you at 16. So she did well and graduated college, went to teach in the South, but wasn't too happy with that. And a friend said to her, why don't you check out China? And you're going to hear this theme again and again, the criticality of networks, information networks that can tell you where opportunities are, how to get where, how to get that. Many of you in the room are very familiar with that. Many of the jobs I got the job before it was advertised, and then the ad was put up just as pro forma. So being in networks is crucial for any level of success. So she goes to China, and as is often the case with formally credentialed people, she started as a teacher of English. Then she connected with a publishing company that does curriculum. And now she's a curriculum specialist and she travels all over East Asia working on English-based curriculum. So she enjoys China, she says, because one, her intellect is acknowledged. She feels that she's engaged not as a woman, not as a black person, with all the negatives that can go with that, but she's engaged as somebody who's smart and has ideas. She's financially very successful, and for those of you, I don't know, who are addicted to traveling, being near a major airline hub is a blessing, because you can, I live in New York, you can go just about anywhere you want. There are lots of flights. So she's in Shanghai, and it's a major hub, so you can go to, say, Thailand, which is another major hub, and you can travel all over. She travels a lot, she's excited, she's seen parts of the world that she would not normally see. An important perspective, two important perspectives she has. She says, one, living in China, you get a different perspective on the world, on news, and how to see things. It has its own biases, but then by definition, all reporting has its own biases. And the second thing she says is, she doesn't deny that there's black racism in China, but that it's not part of the cultural DNA. So you get as a sort of a first response, like people may not necessarily sit next to you on the train, but once people engage you, then they see you as a person. And I'm going to touch base back on that in terms of the Chinese interest in knowledge and getting knowledge. So she contrasted that to the United States, where you're always black. You're always first seen as a black, as a woman, and everything is filtered through that. China, however, comes with its challenges. I'll go into this a little later. One, you're never an immigrant in China. You're always a foreign worker or student. There is no institutionalized sense of a bias that you will live here, you eventually get a green card and become a citizen. So the people who've lived in China for 20 years, and every year you get a 1-year renewal on your visa. You could have a house, you could have a wife. They've begun to give green cards, but again, we'll come back to the knowledge aspect of that. It's very unusual to get a green card. And citizenship is almost out of the question. So there's that sense of you're always a foreigner. There are issues around religion, talk about that, and there are issues around getting life partners. If you're living in a community where people are transiting in and out because there's no sense of living there permanently, finding a partner becomes that more difficult. And especially among the formally educated who are working there as consultants, business persons, there are more women than men, and that creates its own difficulties as well. Okay? So that's one person. Another person is John. John is a Nigerian man trained as an engineer in his late 20s. Good family support system to the degree that he was able to get a degree. He is an Igbo. And if you know anything about Nigeria, the Igbos are discriminated against. If you remember the Biafran War, and it's still simmering there. So he had a lot of difficulty getting work, because again, that means being in a network that has access, and Igbos don't have as much access to that network. Igbos have a long history of transnational trading up and down the west coast of Africa. And this is where, as historians, you have to be careful about a particular bias. There's some Westerners who look at the world from a very Western perspective. It's beginning to change. So everything is oriented towards the West, and that has had structural implications. So for example, if you look at a map of airline routes in Africa, it's easier to get from Africa to Europe, Africa to the Americas than it is to get from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of Africa, or from Central Africa to Southern Africa. So I quickly figured out that Ethiopia was a major hub. Ethiopian Airlines is the largest airline in Africa, and they are doing east-west travel. But the way it was colonized, it was the north to the south, not a lot of south-south traffic. And I'm saying that because of, as historians, what you will find is it's not always easy to understand what went on between, say, East Africa and Asia. There was a lot of traffic back and forth, the Chinese and other groups. You don't hear about it. Because whereas they would have seen the Indian Ocean as a highway, the West saw it as a block. Oh, nothing's happening across there. So the other history, of course, is what happened between the West Coast of the United States and Polynesia and Asia. Almost no history in that. And every now and then something happens that, oh, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know that happened. So historians, I think one of your tasks is really to make sure that those histories that are not spoken to are addressed, are interrogated. So he's talking to his family, and they're saying, somebody knows somebody who went to China. So being youth, he literally, it's relatively easy, it's kind of a little hard, but it's relatively easy to get a visa to go to China for 3 months. Kind of stuff you have to go through to get an American visa or a European visa. It doesn't exist there. He gets a visa and literally gets on a plane going to China knowing no one. Only young people do that kind of stuff. Has no hotel, no job, nothing. So he gets to the airport in Guangzhou. Guangzhou is a huge training center. Chances are half of anything you have on or use was made in Guangzhou, in the Delta region. And he gets to the airport, he's allowed to stay for 3 months, and he says to the taxi driver, take me to where the black people live. Now, if you've ever traveled internationally, and you go into a major hub, the cab drivers have some English. Okay? So he says, oh, Chocolate City. So he takes him to Guangzhou, and he looks for a nightclub. He's now in the country like 4 or 5 hours. He finds a nightclub during the day, and he auditions to be a singer. Now that's where positive stereotypes come in, because in China there's this belief, and not just in China, that black people are good at culture, singing, dancing, and sports. So he gets a job. And he then asks the manager of the club where it is somewhere he can stay. Came with maybe $100 US, and he's off and running. Okay? So, now remember he's Igbo, so that probably is part of his cultural DNA that you learn. Anybody who's traveling, or you get somewhere, you figure out where is the central railroad, where are the hotels, where to eat, where not to eat. You figure that stuff out, but you should figure that stuff out really quickly. So, fast forward, you go to China to make money, you go to China to get knowledge, university, training, what have you. You don't go to China to live. So China, by definition, for many foreigners, is a temporary destination. You go to get something and to leave. The flip side of that is if you don't make money and you don't get developed skills, you're in trouble. But there's no other reason to be in China. So he starts trading, as so many people did. As one woman said to me, you can buy something for $1 in China and you can sell it for $3 in Guinea. So if you know what you're doing, you can make money. However, you have to come with the skill sets of trading, otherwise you'll be exploited. So he comes and he starts trading, and he's doing okay. He runs into 2 difficulties. One, he doesn't really have the knowledge, and he's not in the networks. So he buys some shirts to ship back to Nigeria. He buys 100 shirts. And traders bargain. They haggle. Okay? I discovered you can go into Macy's and haggle. That was an eye-opener. The girlfriend said, no, you don't go and buy 6 shirts and pay $1 for each. You ask them to mark the price down, and they will. I said, Macy? She says, yes. Okay. Maybe she's got some ego in her. So they go and they negotiate that they're buying 100 shirts. The guy says $1 each. He says, no, I'm going to pay you 75 cents. He says, okay. Ships the shirts to Nigeria, and it's one of two problems. The shirt is marked down to 75 cents, but it's a 75 cents quality shirt. It's not a $1 quality shirt with a discount. So they get screwed. Or there's 10 75-cent shirts and 90 25-cent shirts underneath. Okay? So they're enraged. Now, if you're in a network, the network will teach you, you gotta count every shirt, you gotta make sure, you gotta, you know, like how TSA says, was the bag ever outside of the ship? You have to follow that back to the shipper to make sure that what you ordered is what was put in the bag and what got shipped. So there was a lot of bitterness on his part towards both the Chinese, who he felt exploited him, and the Nigerian brokers who facilitated him hooking up with that person, and he's probably getting a kickback from the Chinese person. So again, I keep stressing this, the network, the network, the network. But here's the problem. You don't have any legal recourse. So judgment becomes the judgment of somebody's character. Can I trust you? Who introduced you to me, who I trust, becomes the way you facilitate and judge how you're going to get into business. The law and those kind of things, totally irrelevant. So his next move was to marry a Chinese woman. And they have a baby, cute little baby. I went into this marketplace, lots of African traders. And they've got these gorgeous, you know, you all call it Afro-Chinese, you know, Chinese kids running around. It's just like, you know. And it's kind of, you have to shift your head. Because I grew up in Guyana and Jamaica, among other places. And there are lots of Caribbean Chinese kids, so I'm used to black Chinese, as we call it. But to hear them speaking Chinese is like, okay, this is different. So he's trying to ponder what to do next. I asked him about the marriage, and he says, and this is interesting, China's got a huge internal migrant population. People leaving the countryside to come to the cities for work. Remember, Delta area there is huge manufacturing towns. You got a town where all they do is buttons, another town where all they do is zips. So there's work, but they leave their children, they leave their families. I spoke to one woman and I said, how do you work? She says, I work 7 days a week. So I said, when do you do washing and rest? She says, well, I can ask about the boss for a day off, but the expectation is I will work every day. And she's sending money back to her family so that she can support her brother and her mother. Her father had died. So you've got this internal migrant population who's also hustling, trying to make it in the city far from home. So he marries a woman like that. And he says the family had a concern that he would take the child and the wife back to Nigeria and they would not see their grandchild. I said, what was his concern? He says, well, in China, the baby has to be registered with a Chinese name and has the rights of a Chinese citizen. He has the right to live in China, but cannot work, which is kind of weird. So he says the name is a problem for him because I'm an Igbo, I want my name passed on to my child. The Chinese is saying, no, what's going to go on to the birth certificate is a Chinese name. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit about Chineseness and the distinction between that and being Han, which is the dominant group in China. So he's not happy, and his goal is to get to the United States. He says so that his child can get a decent education. Okay? So here's my core argument, that in this time of late capitalism, late modernity, we have an increasingly large population of individuals who feel that wherever they are in the world, they don't quite fit in. Any of you here familiar with New York City? Good. There's a joke in New York City that the busiest time on the Long Island Railroad is the night before Thanksgiving. And the second busiest time is the morning after Thanksgiving. You go home, you love them, you realize, now I know why I left, and you go back to the city. Okay? So all of us carry some sense of not fitting in. You grew up in a home where your mother said, I treated all my children the same. It's like, that was not the case. There's always this sense of difference. And it's one of the drivers of American culture. Go somewhere else, move, reinvent yourself. But wherever you go, you don't quite fit in. Okay? And I'm arguing that that's very prominent among Black Americans in China, Africana people in China, and it's also prominent among immigrants, because what somebody pointed out once is that increasingly countries want labor, specialized creative labor, whatever you want, but they don't want people. They don't want citizens. So if you look at immigration policies increasingly across the world, you can come, you can work, but you can't become a citizen. Places like Australia, even if your child is born there of non-Australians, they're not Australian. Until relatively recently, 20 years ago, Germany had guest workers from Turkey who came after World War II. So they're probably up to like the fourth generation of people who were born in Germany, their parents were born in Germany, and until relatively recently they couldn't become German because their parents, if you couldn't find a German-born parent who was German, then you couldn't be German, which if you think of it, makes no sense. Scandinavia has a list of names. If you're not on the approved names until recently, you couldn't give your child that name. So there are all these reminders that you don't fit here. So what's going on now with the Trump administration may seem extreme, but in America it's a up and down trend, but it's something that has gone on for a long time. But I'm making a more subtle point that the movement, the increasing self-awareness, makes you psychologically like, don't quite fit. Don't quite fit. I'll give you a silly example. I was born in England, sent to Jamaica at a very early age, returned to England because of immigration concerns, then sent to Guyana, then back to Jamaica, and I've been in New York all my adult life. So when I go to the Caribbean, people don't know where I quite belong. If I'm speaking to Guyanese, they pick up certain Guyanese inflections. If I'm Jamaican, they assume I'm Jamaican. So one day I went to a friend's house for lunch, and buffet, and I took what I wanted. She says, how come you don't take any food? She said, no, food. I said, what do you mean food? No, she said food is plantain, dumpling, banana, ground provisions, or those kind of things. It's not. She says, you're not Jamaican. I said, not quite. That's what I mean, but not quite. Sometimes you're reminded you don't fit in, or sometimes you feel you don't fit in. I remember a high school student many years ago saying to me, he felt sad with his friends because some of them still believe that the moon followed them when they were driving, which is a fantasy. You give up 8, 9, you realize the moon is not followed. I mean, deep down I think the moon follows me, but I'm educated enough to know that it doesn't. Okay? Some people never get to that point. Okay? This sense of not fitting in gives rise to what I call adaptive ambivalence. And by adaptive ambivalence, I mean you increasingly live psychologically in a place where you have mixed feelings about home and you have mixed feelings about wherever you are. So, let me ask you, why do you like the original home? Why do you like your original home?
The
And home is broadly defined.
The food that I grew up to eat with,
Good food.
that I cannot find here.
You just don't taste the same. I went to Jamaica the other day and somebody asked me to bring back Kentucky Fried Chicken. I said, why would I bring back Kentucky Fried Chicken? She said, the Jamaican Kentucky Fried Chicken, it don't taste the same. She has no interest in going there to live, but she's got this connection to the food. Any other reason?
Nostalgia.
For?
Nostalgia.
For?
For what you like. So I was born in India, and we lived in an extended family for a short period of time when I was there. So that idea of living with a lot of my relatives, and then coming here to the States in a nuclear family, very different. So in my child, I still have a memory of what it was like for me as a child, even though India changed.
Yeah.
So
No, but it's a, these places in your head, they're not imaginary, but they, you can't go back. Exactly. So a friend of mine went back, and he said within 3 days he was ready to get on a plane and leave. Like the food, he said the raindrops were warm, the music was nice, but the irritating aunts, the slow bureaucracy, all of that was there.
Hospitality. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, so we are a very nice city. We're profiled every year in national magazines about being one of the friendliest cities in America. And yet, when I'm not in Charleston, South Carolina, and other places in America, I go, boy, these people don't know how to say hi back to you. So I miss that. Smiling.
For me, the geography, I'm from Fayetteville, so I'm suburban. So when I'm in a place that's not suburban or rural, it feels awkward. So like when I'm in the city or something, I can tolerate it, but I don't like it.
My brother came to stay with me in New York, and he was supposed to spend a week with his wife. After 3 days they left. I said, he said, the noise, the absence of sunlight, the people walk too quickly. When I go to Charlotte, 2 days, I said, there's nothing going on here. Where are the people? There are no sirens,
The weather. For a lot of people come from a tropical climate and then they move to Winnipeg, where I used to live, and they don't.
Winnipeg?
Yeah.
Oh.
My family's from Guyana too.
Oh, I lived in, where in Guyana?
Georgetown.
Yeah, I lived in
My
Linden.
mom was born in Windsor Forest.
Okay, so it's very, Guyana is tropical. In the rainy season, it starts at 9, it finishes at 3, it doesn't stop. You stay home and you read. And Winnipeg, I think a warm day is like 10 degrees or something like that. So the contrast is very
I
good.
have a question that you said, but what about people that, like for me, I'm from here, but when I travel throughout the United States, it's kind of like I feel connected to, people will say, well, are you from here, where are you from? When I'm from Baltimore, I'm not from here, so it's like a ancestral tie. So what do you, it's nostalgia anywhere I travel, but what do you because it's not actually being from there, but it's when I interact with certain, it's particularly Nigerians, particularly certain people from Jamaica, it'll be like, you remind me of so-and-so, or, certain things I may do or say, but I'm not from there. But it's certain things that I may do that maybe remind them of something at home, and I have no idea what.
What you see is what I call weak commonalities. If you go on the internet, you will find all of these statements. I know something about black people, so I can talk about it, but I'm sure it's good for other groups. So like, you'll see, you're a Jamaican if you give directions with your head. Over there, over there. But the Dominicans say the same thing, the Trinidadians say the same, everybody's claiming it as theirs. But the key thing is when you do it, they understand exactly what you mean. Or
but I don't get it. They get it, but I don't for me, it's diversifying and understanding other parts because it's more, because we're everywhere. So when they say, you remind me of this, and I don't understand it. Because
people say the same thing to me, and I'm like, they're seeing something in me that I either don't see myself or take so for granted. Do you know what this means?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Well, when I was in school, that was a racial term to describe Asians.
Interesting, very interesting. What does this mean? The man borrowed some money from me.
So different things.
Meaning?
I I need some money.
I'm still waiting for him to pay me back. Like,
Oh, where's my money at? I'm waiting.
Right.
Oh, I need to use that one.
right. So once you do that, and every culture has these non-verbal ways of expressing themselves. People but more importantly, they also have other techniques, other ways of where you can not finish the statement and you know exactly what the person means. Okay. All right. Let me talk now more about China and blacks.
Yeah, I just have a question about something you said earlier in the story about the black woman. I couldn't figure out if it was your voice or her voice when you were talking about why she liked it, and you said that racism was not a part of the cultural DNA. So my question is, because I don't know if you were saying she felt that or you're saying that, because my question is, well, if it's not, then how did they come to be racist? Where did they learn it from? Because in your article, one of the articles I read, talked about, in terms of barbarianism, blacks are at the lowest, recent protests involving racial profiling, interracial dating. So I thought that was a very provocative statement that it's not in someone's cultural DNA, because I'm not sure I'm sold on that.
What she's arguing, this was her voice and others have argued, not that there isn't racism, but it's not deep. That once the Chinese person gets to know you, okay, they begin to see you as a person, not as a racial act. Where she argues that in the States, she's always first seen and always seen as black.
And see, I would counter that with having gone to school with majority white people who said to me, "Oh, you're different than other black people." So so that's kind of, that response is like, oh, it kind of makes my skin crawl.
It does, because the point I think you're making is that the default, they start with from a racist perspective. But China is much more than race, and I'm going to go through that. And one of the things as historians you always do is you question the definitions being used. Well, what do you mean by black? Okay? I know folks who in the Caribbean were seen as elites because they were very light skinned. They come to America, you black. So you always have to ask, what does the term mean? How is it being used? And what's people's self-interest? So, for example, during slavery, all blacks weren't treated the same way by the slave master. If you had a skill that was critical for the running of that mill or that plantation, they treated you slightly differently because messing with you would shut down production. Whereas if you were a laborer, so there were blacks and there were blacks, it's complicated. So what we try to do as thinkers is when we hear these definitions, we're like, how is it being used, in what context, what's the history? So, for example, there's a guy called Wyatt who wrote about blacks in prehistoric China. And he says, black meant dark-skinned relative to the Chinese. And that it oftentimes was referring to people from Malaysia, from other parts of Asia, not from Africa. But then again, Africans have been moving into Asia for thousands of years. So there's a large, long-standing population of blacks in India, discriminated against, which speaks to your point. But there are also many dark-skinned Indians. And when I went to India, I was surprised how dark people were compared to what you see on Bollywood. And an Indian friend of mine just laid out his own racism. He says, yeah, the smart ones are in universities, and the ones who are not very bright, they go to Bollywood.
I wondered also the extent to which colorism is connected to class, right? Because a person's skin will get darker if they're working outside. Yeah. And if also there is just in Asia as well, sort of that colorism related to whether a person is working outside and therefore low skilled.
Good point, because one of the subjects I spoke to was very light skinned, and in the summer she would get brown because she'd go to the beach. And I don't know if you've seen pictures of Chinese women at the beach, many of them cover up, so that's because the lighter you are, the more African the colorism, but it's a fluctuating colorism. And her friend said to her, the Chinese friend said to her, I prefer you in the winter when your lifetime. The other thing about race in China is that for the overwhelming majority of Chinese, their only exposure to black folks is through the media. And if you read the media, the story is depressingly a bad one. I mean, I look at The Guardian, the New York Times, all you hear is bad news. You don't hear about interesting things going on, positive things going on in Africa. By the way, I should clarify something here. The term Africana, which I use, refers to basically two groups. One, persons from the African continent, or persons in the African diaspora. So, it gets complicated. My father is born in Somalia, so I go to Somalia, I say, you're Somali. I say, I don't speak the language, I don't want to say, you're Somali, your father's born here, end of story. Here's the passport if you want it. But I consider myself Africana because I'm not from the continent. And then going back to this latest point, the relationships between all those people is very weak. Weak connections. It's like, 3 generations ago, your family came from Scandinavia. You do a little Scandinavian light, but okay. The critical difference here being historically, because of the negativeness attached to blackness, you get reminded that you're not American, you're not this, you're not, the blackness comes first. But one of the things you'll see is when people of Africana groupings get together, they struggle to find commonalities, differences, depending on the group. So one guy, very dark skinned, was hanging out with some Sudanese. If you know the Sudanese, many of them are extremely dark. There's a famous model here. And they said to her, you know why you're so light? Is it because you got white blood in you? So they were teasing him. So there's all this, again, as historians, you understand the constructed nature of identity. Well, what kind of African are you? Where are you from? And even Africana is a Western term. When you speak to people from Africa, they tell you their ethnic groups and they tell you their nationalities. They don't say, I'm black, I'm African. Once they come to North America, you're talking to like cab drivers, I'm from Africa. So, we're in Africa. What's your ethnic group? There's a big difference between being a Yoruba Nigerian and an Igbo Nigerian. But if you don't ask, you just get the surface thing. And so the challenge you see in China is there's this negative message that they're getting. And many of them are not very familiar with the geography of Africa. So they know African Americans are from the United States. Other than that, everybody else is from Africa. So a friend of mine was from Jamaica. She took a map. And she said, this is where Jamaica is, not in Africa. This is Jamaica, this is Africa. The next day, a Chinese person introduced her friend and said, oh, meet Mary. She's from Jamaica in Africa. So what Africa means is very complicated in China. But at a minimum, it means dark skin and you're from the continent or you're from, and then there's a hierarchy of blacks where the African Americans are seen as elite. Traveling around the world with a blue passport and blue American passport makes a big difference if you're black. I don't know if you're white, what difference it makes, but if you're black, visa lines disappear, they know you're not coming to their country to stay. It's really a fascinating experience. The second issue to bear in mind is China's antipathy to foreignness. China has a long history of being conquered by non-Han people, and that's a critical distinction. The Han is the largest ethnic group in China, 91% of the population, and then there are like 56 other ethnic groups who make up the remaining 9 or 10%. But the Han, there's a history of them being dominated. So like the Manchus were not originally from China, ran China for a long period of time. So the Han, who are now dominant and in power, carry this long-standing suspicion of foreigners, and they have a hierarchy of foreigners, and blacks are at what they call black is at the bottom. But here's a trade-off. The Chinese are also, they hold in very high esteem knowledge. And they've always felt that they were at a disadvantage to the West in knowledge. So whereas they look down on the West in non-intellectual ways, they admire them for their technology, their know-how, their innovativeness, their ideas. So there's this ambivalence about the foreigner who is liked for what she knows, but the other cultural pieces we don't necessarily like. And that's what's interesting about being black and smart in China. We may not particularly like your blackness, whatever it is it means, but we will respect you, relate to you, pay you very well if you are knowledgeable, with the unstated understanding that you're going to transfer that knowledge to us.
And it's a saying here that you like black culture but not black people.
Yeah. But it's slightly different because people are hungry, or because remember China is a total authoritarian society, so there are a lot of things people don't know. So if, I heard this a lot, if the Africana person makes an effort to learn Chinese, a whole different world opens up to them. They're embraced, they're taken in, people are curious about them, they're curious about people, and these are human beings. Friendships and relationships develop. The unfortunate thing we have in the United States is the segregation. So you don't get to know people as people. You're black, and it's workplace, it's a subway, and that's about it. Okay? In fairness, I don't want to seem like America is awful. Something is changing out there in the United States around race, because what I see going on in class, at school, with the students, the way they relate to others, is not the way I relate to them. There's a lot more mixing, there's a lot more understanding, and of course there are a lot more bicultural students. You know, kids with black father, white mother, that kind of thing. So something is beginning to shift out there, because you get much more subtle arguments around race in the classroom, and kids who you think identify as black saying to her, no, it's a bit more complicated because my mother is white, or da-da-da-da-da. So one has to keep one eyes open. So this openness to knowledge, this hunger for knowledge, means that even as China is not giving resident visas, they're giving creative visas. They want, and a lot of countries do that. Well, the United States seems to be having some issues around that, but that's a different story. You get a creative visa in China, you will get a good job. So it was not unusual for me to run into someone like this shoe designer who was recruited from abroad, brought to China. He gets 2 business class tickets back to the United States every year. His housing is paid for. He has a car, a driver, and he designed shoes. So he felt, he says, being a black person, I know what it is to not know and not be in a network where you know. So he's trying to train his assistant to be a very good business manager. So he peppers her with questions and ideas. And he's found a reluctance, and she says, well, my job is not to think through ideas. My job is just to do what you tell me to do. So he's been working on her in that. So somebody explained, well, China is the kind of place you gotta be careful about sticking your neck out. Because if you say something that's politically incorrect, or is not going with whatever the policy is, it can have very serious implications. So people have to be careful. But the hunger for idea is there, and the blacks are, any other group, including blacks, if you have ideas, they're interested in ideas. Okay? This relates to the whole question of market and capitalism. Today, you're not producing, you're not creative, as they say in Jamaica, the dog will eat your supper. You're in trouble. You're only as good as the ideas you have. And as teachers, you know the language, critical thinking, innovation, entrepreneurship. And the market is penetrating even more every aspect of our lives, including how we present ourselves to the world as attractive. It's like, okay, so what do you know? How can I monetize this? How can you make money off it? And it's leading to some interesting distortions where the best and the brightest are going to the most shallow of things if it can make them money. So I was on the subway the other day, and some kid, and I'm sure it's a bright person, wrote an app that allows you to have erectile dysfunction medication delivered to, quote, your neighbor. Because you're not going to admit that you need it. And it's all over the subway. I'm like, no, we've got a serious homeless problem in New York City. We have a serious high school graduation rate, but that's where the money is going. Same thing in China, where you find that values are being changed in terms of The Chinese want folks who are technically very proficient, technically very creative, but that creativity cannot carry over into politics. The problem with creative people is they come up with ideas that are not necessarily market. They come up with art that troubles you. They come up with political ideas, they want rights. And China is so hot on that. So how are they going to manage that? It's a time bomb that they are now struggling with.
I just think that you're making a magnificent argument for the importance of humanities
Yes.
in the curriculum
Yeah.
and for the importance of perspective taking, which I think, I know in my school in Massachusetts, we're just still getting inundated with the STEAM and the STEM, and all the students are coming in indoctrinated with that. And it is leading to a stultification and imagination.
What the market does is, I don't know if you're familiar with the idea of commodification. It takes something special and everybody quickly learns it. So there are certain high schools who have commodified the SAT, they've commodified how to get their kids into the top 20 high school colleges. And it's creating a problem for the colleges because they're getting all these hookup kids who they all know the same things. And I stopped teaching honors programs because I felt I was in front of a bunch of lawyers. And said, okay, this idea of blackness in China, what do you think? Well, what do you mean by black, and which China are you talking about? And they would interrogate me to the point where I almost had to give them the answer, and then say, oh, this is what I think, consistent with what they thought, I thought. So I'm finding it increasingly hard among the so-called bright students to get them to play with ideas. They're not playing. They're like, you're gonna mess up my grade point average. You're gonna mess up my grade point average. The problem is, when they get, not to the university, but when they get to the university calls very carefully. If you're paying $60,000 a year, they're not going to fail you. You'll come with a respectable B. And the tragedy is, what the employers are doing is, they go for that 10% who are really bright, and that 10% tell the 90% what to do. And the students haven't caught on yet that there are two doors. You can go to Harvard and you can go through, I think something like 70% of Harvard students graduate with some kind of honors or award. And then there's this other door. And it's the white males who are still going through that door. The others don't realize that that door exists. So it's an interesting creativity problem. In some subtle ways we're finding creativity is beginning to level off. Now, if you're putting that fine mind of yours to erectile dysfunction advertising, we got global warming. I'm not saying people aren't going to global warming and homelessness and all that other hard problem, but that's not what you hear. So when the students come in, you find they have a very narrow range of professions they want to go into. I mean, I can't put a sign on my door that says, we do not need any more lawyers, when I'm tempted to do that. Because they all want to become, first generation, be a lawyer, be a doctor. It's like, that's another story. But you're right, this creativity problem is a struggle.
I just wanted to say that the room that you're in contains groups of teachers who teach, I love the expression, teach like your hair's on fire, who get students, this may be the last stop before they go on to the rest of their lives to get the humanities, to get a sense of the world. Many of them teach world history, world geography, humanities, all those things. So right here, concentrated in this room from all over the US, are people who are trying to be that last stop for those students.
Yes.
And the courses they teach are transformative for their minds.
Very good, very good. Very good to hear that. Because going back to your point about they like black culture but they don't like black people. Black culture is consumed in China and it's extremely subversive. You listen to someone like some of the cutting edge rappers, or you follow the debate with Kanye West and you're like, whoa, there's more going on, and the kids down there, they suffer. So there's this other stuff going on that we don't hear about. So the population is mostly transient, made up of teachers who teach English all over China, and have interesting receptions where like they'll be the first black person that the Chinese have ever seen. One teacher said she was in a school and they came up to her and rubbed her hand to see if the color came on. She probably rubbed their hand and everybody laughed. They got the point immediately. So there's wide exposure for some individuals. Also you have students in China. And one interesting thing about the students is to go to a Chinese university, because the Chinese universities where the instruction is in English, to go to a Chinese university, you have to do a 10-month immersion course in Chinese, speaking and writing. So at the beginning of your second year, you get dumped into Engineering 101, instruction in Chinese, sink or swim, or dentistry, or whatever it is you're studying. And so they have a unique perspective on China for black folks because they speak the language. The interesting thing also is that they may be in a dorm, because the Chinese keeps the foreign students in a separate dorm, where the common language is Chinese. You speak English, you speak French, you speak Portuguese. Nobody speaks English. The common language is the Chinese that they're learning. So that's is going to have ripple effects, which I don't know what they are, but it's an interesting. They leave. Most of the students leave. One subgroup stays, which is those who failed. Now, if you leave a country to go abroad, you can't come back, as they say in Jamaica, with your two long hands. What did you do? What did you achieve? So they try to become traders. But one of the key points I want to make is, if you're unsuccessful at home, chances are you're going to be unsuccessful in China. Because that meant you didn't have good networks at home. For some reason you weren't smart enough, or you had emotional problems. Whatever the difficulties you had at home, China will exacerbate them. So I saw a woman who, very bright mathematician, but socially isolated. Her parents only related to her through her report card. Her teachers were her love objects. Now, as many of you here teaching, these are not your children. These are your students. So you tend to their intellect. You're sensitive to their emotional needs, but that's not your job, and most of you, there's a counseling center, you listen empathically, you move them on. So she goes to China, she gets a wonderful job teaching, but she has no friends. She teaches, and then she goes home and she locks herself in a room, because the same social problems she has at home, she has them in China. Okay? The executives are recruited, and very high quality life. The risk for them is they live in a bubble, because they talk to other executives who are in China temporarily, okay? And also who are in a bubble where they're talking to only other executives. As kids all go to international schools, they don't speak Chinese, and the Chinese they interact with have a foreign orientation. They're sensitive to the West. Many of them have lived outside, so they're not doing so well. There's a very small community of people, black people who've been in China for like 30 years. Mostly Nigerians, and they're the largest group in China. And they've begun some advocacy work carefully. China got to be careful you push, because the Chinese are suspicious of community-led group activities not approved by the state. So politically, you try to negotiate where there's some room to negotiate. That, of course, lends itself to corruption, visa corruption, that kind of stuff. So some of these groups are pushing back in terms of police sweeps, picking up everybody. This is mostly in southern China, where you can be guilty of one of what they call the 3 illegals. Illegal residency, meaning your visa has expired. You don't have permission to live in that neighborhood, and you're working. So it all comes on visa. So it's residence, visa, and work. And you can be deported. But the thing is, when the Chinese deport you, first they put you in jail, and then somebody's got to pay the fine, and then raise the fear to get you out of jail. It's not like here where we just put you on a plane and send you back. So that's a risk there. There's a small group of Afro-Chinese families who I've mentioned, and then there's an even smaller group of Chinese men who went abroad and married an Africana woman. And you hear hints of them, but I've never met any of those people, but I understand that they exist. Spiritual challenges. As I said, China approves of religion, but it's religion that's under state supervision. You can't just set up a church in China and preach whatever you want. So the churches and the mosques and other religious institutions that exist I've got to give these non-political sermons. And what's considered non-political in China is a very large area. So people complain that it's bland. It's kind of a Kentucky kind of fried education. So some people have made underground churches, illegal churches, which meets, I was speaking with one person, and her church met in a nightclub in the morning. So like on a Sunday morning, everybody's gone. And they were into intense, there are two ways you can think of religion: world embracing or world renouncing. The world embracing is activists or capitalists. I'll talk about that in a second. The world embracing is, again, the world is a terrible place. Prepare yourself to go to the sweet by and by. You know, this is Babylon. It's all Old Testament. Okay? Whereas the world embracing can be more advocacy, more rights oriented, or come to church and pray and you'll get money. You know, some of these mega churches, nutrition, money making, mortgage, you got all these workshops. Some people say, well, where's this spiritual piece to? So those underground churches routinely get shut down. And what the Chinese do is they'll just send you a text, please move on. So every 3 months you move the church, and then 3 months to get another. It's very civilized. If you continue resisting, they will raid, deport. So people realize when you get that text, time to make a move. Okay? But some of those churches are problematic in the sense that they cater to low-paid Africana workers who are failing in China. They're not doing well, they're not making money. And they go to church, and the priest says, if we pray for you, God will reward you on this earth. So it's a kind of, there's this term cruel optimism, where you think you're going to succeed, and everything says, no, you're not, and you don't. Okay? There are also the ethical challenges of working in China. China is a cutthroat, capitalist, state-run capitalist economy. And in the business world, no quarter is asked, no quarter is given. So you find a lot of people get robbed, as I mentioned earlier, or have to be very, very vigilant in terms of how they engage in. And there we see the discrimination against the foreigner. Prices are more expensive, court judgments go against you, you just have to be wise. But there's a more subtle risk, people have said, is that you don't then become unethical. You don't behave the way that they behave. You don't shove, you don't spit everywhere, you don't rob people. Very hard when everybody around seems to be doing that behavior. Okay. Just a couple points on being a black person, which China highlights just because of the difference. One, the resource lack. Chinese understand that, and black people in China like being there because there's a little bit more access to resources on the cognitive and intellectual side. So there's this Indian-American economist, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen speaks of resources. He says you have to have access to resources to get skills. And those skills give you agency or freedom. So Sen's argument is if you don't have the resources, you're not going to be free. You're not going to be happy. Skilled. And many Africana people are coming from low resource environments. So when they get to China, they see it as an opportunity to grow and develop intellectually and financially, and they grab it. That's in that sense they say there's less racism, there's less discrimination against them. They have to struggle psychologically, having grown up with what I call negative essentializing. The idea that if you're black, you're retarded, you're not smart, you don't have any skills. And that's something they carry within them. And some of them realize that they're surprised when people relate to them as if you're smart, you have things to offer. That's an internal struggle that they go on. Being a capitalist economy means if you got a skill, somebody will pay you for it. That's an advantage, but it's also a risk for shallow living, where everything is consuming. You have the nice apartment, you have the nice car. I don't know how many of you know the poem Richard Cory? Google it and look it up. It's a rich man who kills himself and everybody's shocked. He had everything in the world. It's a whole materially rich, emotionally
What's
impoverished.
your name again?
Richard Corey, C-O-R-Y, I think.
Edward Arlington Robinson.
What's the last name?
Edward Arlington Robinson.
Robinson. Edward Arlington
Robinson.
Robinson. Wrote it. Richard Corey.
Simon and Garfunkel recorded it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Simon and Garfunkel.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They made that song.
Whoa, whoa. Okay. So in the market, you shape yourself to the market. What do you hold back? What does the market not try to capture? So somebody was showing me the other day, like how mindfulness has become so commodified. So we're all into mindfulness, but you need a mindfulness blanket, you need a mindfulness sound machine, all 39.95 with operators standing by. You know, and I saw this in New York. I don't know if you saw it in other parts of the country. Around 5 years ago, almost every woman of a certain age was carrying a yoga mat on her. Okay? You don't see as many anymore. Maybe they're carrying mindfulness mats now. But the market quickly captures whatever it is that you're trying to do to make yourself special and unique. And in that sense, China is a huge temptation to just go strictly material. Okay? What are the psychological consequences of all of this? One, you left home because you didn't fit in. There weren't enough opportunities for your intellect. Maybe your family was crazy. We know those people. You come to China and you're making money, you get an education, but you're not accepted in the community. So you go back home periodically for the food, the weather, grandma, and after a week you realize, I can't stay here. I cannot stay here. It is still too crazy. You go back to China, you realize, I don't really like China because there's no community. So you end up in this in-between space. But again, this is not peculiar to China. All of us know increasingly struggle with that sense of, I don't quite fit in. And you have to figure out how to work that because it's a permanent condition. And there's a guy called Mitchell who argues about us having multiple aspects of the self. And you learn when to deploy which aspect in which situation. A very basic idea is code switching. When you're with your friends, your language changes. You speak peer language, it's not the way you speak to your kids. Or you may talk like you come from Jamaica when you're with Jamaicans, that kind of thing. So you learn which part of the self to deploy on the which thing. And it begs the question of what's your true self? And the argument is there is no true self. It's this combination of selves that are always sometimes in conflict with each other, sometimes deferring to each other, depending on the situation you're in. So I can be very assertive. The minute I walk into an airport, I said, you will not argue with anyone, you will not curse anybody out, you have no rights here, except maybe to get on a plane and maybe to get a seat. Because it's almost as the system is set up to provoke you to lose your temper and then you can't get on the plane. Okay? So you learn which self to deploy. It's costly. In-betweenness is costly, but you learn how to work it. Because one of its advantages is that from the outside, you see interesting things that other people don't see. And they like you for that. You bring a perspective to bear that's different, where you can, one woman said, it was in Jamaica, in China, she discovered her blackness and the different ways it was to be black. So she got permission in China to be black the way she wanted to be black. She didn't have to be black the way they said at home. She could wear her hair however she wanted, she could speak with whatever accent, she could take a bit from Congo, she could take a bit from Nigeria, because she was exposed to all of these different ways of being black. But she wasn't embedded in a way that she couldn't see, you know, what it was like, or had to go along with the thing. So people always think, African American, I said, you're not really African American, are you? I said, no. And goes to you're not really African American, are you? Jamaican, I said, no. Because you fit in this in-between space, and some cultures don't give you the permission to be in between. You must be black in this way. You must be a woman in this way. So one of the advantages is a bit more space.
You know, but what you're saying is not necessarily unique to China. I mean, it could be her own fears about being true to her identity in America. I mean, go to Germany.
Well, stop. What we're questioning is, what does it mean to be true to your... How many people in this room know I'm going to be a little racist here in my discrimination. Know black people who hate hip hop, hate it, will not listen to the language. I don't like hip hop as a. Huh?
I don't enjoy
Right,
it.
but when I saw all the kids coming in and I'm like, you better get with this thing, you better understand it. So I print out the lyrics and I got back at them and said, analyze that. What is Lamar saying there? And so when you say true identity, we're questioning what that means.
Well, I guess maybe to be clearer and slower, I guess I'm using the word celebration. I don't think there is to be a celebration of China because this person felt like I had a space to be an African American, because as a traveler myself, I totally get that, but that's not just in China. That can be in Turkey, that can be in Japan, because the society in America, the black and white elements of it, say, but you're supposed to speak like this. This is the school you should have gone to, and that you don't have these things. So that's all the point I'm making.
Well, wherever you are, my point is the in-betweenness is experience. And in China, that's how it's experienced. But it's not unique to, I mean, you could just move from the left side of one city to the right side and just have more room to breathe and be different in so many ways.
Can you, do you remember what you were saying? You said some cultures don't, some places or some cultures don't allow you to utilize your own, I'm sorry, I wrote
Intellectually,
yeah.
some cultures don't have the institutional framework for you to develop technical skills. It's like there's no technical university. Life can be at risk. So in many parts of the world, there are no children specialized hospital. Children die from things they don't have to die from. But also it can restrain you because the curriculum in the schools may orient you towards underachievement. You all know very much about that kind of thing. The joke is told of, it's not a joke, it actually happened. V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel, right, was asked to go to Uganda to judge a poetry competition. He says on two conditions, one, business class, all in his material comfort, and he says the highest prize can only be a third prize. So he says nobody in Uganda can possibly write poetry that would get a first prize. Now when that gets enshrined in the curriculum, when you have a curriculum that doesn't, you all know this, doesn't talk about you, doesn't show you, doesn't beat your achievements, that psychologically becomes very limited no matter where you go in the world, and that's a piece of work you have to do.
Yes, hi. My question is, why do you think that the Chinese are playing more on the negative stereotypes of black people? I understand that their connection and their understanding of black people is Kanye West, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson, Prince, Beyonce. But yet, when they see Africans and African Americans coming into China, they're weighing more on the negative stereotypes. They're not assuming that every African and African American that comes to China is a Michael Jordan or Beyonce. They're weighing in on the negative that they see in social media, not the positive. Why do you think that is?
Because of what they're exposed to. That's part of an answer. The deeper question is, why do people discriminate? I can't. Every group does it. A friend of mine in the World Cup lost badly. Didn't make it into the World Cup this year, but she says we always beat the Nigerians. That was all that mattered to her, that they beat the Nigerians. Okay? So groups discriminate, and what I'm hearing is, yes, the Chinese do, but there's a bit more room there. If you're there, if you learn the language, if you get in the culture, it's a different experience than being in the United States, where.
Right, I agree.
So it's a question of degree, not everybody's race. I remember most of them have never met a black person other than what they see on the television.
Yes, you had said it really helps if you're in China, if you learn Chinese. Now my question is, here in the States we have a fairly developed ESOL program for people from other countries to learn English. Do they have a Chinese as a second language or any specific program to teach Africans or any other country foreigners to learn Chinese?
You go and you. One woman I spoke to, what she did, she went to the nail salon and she just sat there for hours and talked to the owner, and that's how she learned. In other words, you have to do the work. And she did the work, and she said they're tight. The woman tells her things she hasn't told her husband. Yeah, what I always have to remember in the United States is that the discrimination we've had here historically has made for segregation. So it's very hard to casually, you have to go out of your way to mix in many cities in the United States. Whereas they're saying in China, you also have to make the effort. But if you don't make the effort and you're not, brave that way, the stereotypes are what kind of dominate.
I was just, on Monday and Tuesday, we learned about the Hui and Uyghurs in China, China's Muslim population. I was wondering if among the Nigerians who are in primarily Guangzhou, if there are any Nigerian Muslims, and the extent to which, if there are, they've integrated or connected with the Chinese Muslims.
I don't know if you've heard the rule Silk Road, and the one world, one belt something.
Yeah.
It started in Guangzhou thousands of years ago. That was where Marco Polo ended up. So there's a long tradition of Muslims, and they're huge mosques, and what you learn to don't push the boundaries. So they're there.
But are there Nigerians?
Yes, there's a huge Nigerians, Ghanaians, what do we call it? Muslim majority countries? Tons of them in China. Lots of them with their own institutions.
I have another question, sort of related to a section you haven't addressed too much, which is referring to the idea that of immigrant relationships here in the U.S. among immigrants, how they see sometimes the situation with Hispanics and blacks in America and whites, and they sort of take it at face value. Yeah, that's kind of how it is, right? But don't see why and don't know the history. My own husband's from Egypt, and we sort of sat down when Eyes on the Prize was showing in the 90s, and in the 80s rather, and he's like, what? That happened here? I'm like, yeah, it did. So how are relations between different immigrant groups in China? Do they have sort of hierarchy? Do they take things at face value? What sort of racial ideas do they seem to bring to the
Among
table?
each other?
Yeah.
A couple of things. One, there is the homogenizing by the Chinese. You're all black. You're all from Africa. And that's how we're going to treat you. So that forces them to deal with a commonality, which you saw also with African Americans. There's this larger force that this is how they're defining you. This is how they relate to you. And you've got to take those descriptions seriously. Okay? So that forces a sort of a weak but commonality. Within themselves, there are differences. And so the Guineans have a national association. The Malians have a national associations. The more enlightened ones will overlook that to fight for a common cause. So one thing that they do in Guangzhou is indigenous policing, because there's a drug problem. And the Chinese will just round up people. So what they've started doing is policing their own ranks, telling people selling drugs, stop, otherwise we're going to report you to the authorities, because you're endangering everyone. So it's forcing some commonalities, but it's not very deep. It's more commonality in relation to the Chinese experience. But if people mix and they're human beings, they start having effects on each other. They start to see difference and commonalities, and that's beginning to happen. But remember, because the population is so transient, it's not a diaspora. It's a kind of a weak enclave. How you get to know somebody, they're gone. 2-3 years is a very short time to know, especially that person is oriented outwards. They're just gone. So you start all over again and you're suspicious. And many of them are now saying that you've got to judge people as individuals because your own kin will rob you in terms of financial transactions. So get to know this person. Don't just suppose that because he's evil, he's on your side and you're evil. So it's very, but the transience is a major, I won't say problem, but.
That's a really interesting contrast for those of us who teach history, world history. This is very, very different from the 18th and 19th centuries when you had the factors who went out to China or went out even to the Near East from Europe, and they would stay there for their whole lives. They would often intermarry, they would often go Turk if they were in the Mediterranean area, dress, have a portrait made of themselves. And many of those for history buffs here, have written a lot of letters home, and there's a lot of artifacts that refer to them. So this is very different in the kind of environment you're describing, where people have access to airplanes and they're going back and forth very quickly. But those people would not only establish enclave communities, but they would also stay there for years and years and years. And in Malaysia, I believe, you know, you had a situation where foreign European men were marrying Malay women who had very powerful economic situations and the upper hand over them, as a matter of fact. So,
but just remember that this is this community is relatively short-lived in terms of its numbers, from 1990s. And that's historically, you can't really say much. You don't know. There are other things going on. There are people marrying Chinese, people who live there. There are people who have no intention of leaving. So what's going to happen down the road? And remember, China is under increasing pressure because China exports people. And some of the other governments are now saying, hold on, you're treating my people like crap. You got 20,000 Chinese in Nigeria. We're going to start looking at them differently. So how that's going to evolve as China becomes more, and China has no choice about becoming part of the World Economic Community, it's going to put pressures. And are they going to shut down again and turn inwards?
interesting.
Yes, from what I've read, I understand that a woman who is Chinese who's married to someone who is African, their child, yes, thank you, their child can only be classified as African, not Chinese, because of the father being African. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
That's not my understanding. The child is considered Chinese. The opposite problem is you can't have dual nationality. You're Chinese. If you try to invoke any other nationality, then you're not Chinese. Okay? So there was a famous case of this young woman whose father was African American and mother was Chinese. Father left, not knowing the mother was impregnated. Child grows up, goes on China's Got Talent, and all hell breaks loose. Because she can't be Chinese, because she's black, speaks Chinese, has never gone outside China, doesn't speak English. And there was this huge debate because to be Chinese, you by definition, you look a particular way. And she didn't look that way. And China's beginning to realize there are people here who don't look what you think are Chinese, who look black culturally in how they define blackness, but are Chinese. So that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. And the thing is, as historians, you know this. Once you start looking for that, you'll find it. So now, one of the top sprinters in the world, and one of the top tennis players are of Japanese heritage. They're black. One of their parents is black. They phenotypically look black, and they grew up in Japan. One of the top Chinese, I think it's volleyball players, is black, is Chinese and black. So they're there. They're not a major factor, but they're there. And over time, history tells us they probably will grow, assuming no ethnic cleansing or anything like that. The most subtle problem is that China doesn't care how you look in a funny way. Do you follow the Han ideology? So some of the groups they're persecuting, it's very sophisticated how they go after them. They will identify young people in there, give them full scholarships, admit them to the Chinese Communist Party, and divide them within. Okay? So you find in those groups they have that they call splittists, people who don't follow the original Tibetan philosophy. They're Chinese, Tibetan, and they want Tibetans to become Chinese. So it's very complicated.
Matthew Wynn from Fayetteville, North Carolina. My question is this. So basically from what, and I'm just want to clarify something. So what you're saying is essentially is that in China does not want enculturation. They want assimilation. And so those individuals who are migrants from West Africa, Nigeria, when they're coming in, and those groups, they want them to assimilate into the culture, not or explain.
They want to leave.
They want them to leave.
The assimilation is for the non-Han Chinese.
Non-Han Chinese.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to get clear on
but
that.
the whole thing is China and Hanness is seen as the same when it's not.
Okay. I just want to
Yeah,
clarify.
yeah. No, they don't want them to. They don't want them to.
Because you were talking about intermarriage,
Yeah.
and so.
What's the name of this basketball player? Marbury?
Stephon Marbury.
Yeah, he got the green card
Yeah.
Okay.
because he plays professional football there. I mean, when people like LeBron goes on there, they have to carry like 900 security because people say, oh my God, LeBron is there.
Okay.
But they don't want him to live there. But he got a green card. But that's the exception. Most people are like, hi, come. Until recently, China didn't even have a central immigration policy because the assumption is, nobody's coming here to migrate. You're coming here to work and then leave.
Okay.
Professor Carlton, thank you for coming here today. Religious freedom. I understand you said that as long as you don't push the boundaries, the Chinese government's okay, with you. But I mean, I'm just thinking about the East Turkestan, Uyghurs of East Turkestan, and I don't think there are any boundaries as far as the government's control is concerned. I mean, it's from all reports, it's beyond description of any Orwellian oppression. And I remember specifically one headline in the New York Times not that long ago. The Muslim shopkeepers in what they call the new region, the Chinese, they were ordered to sell alcohol and tobacco. And not only sell them, they were required to have at least 5 kinds of each and to display them prominently. If not, they were going to be fined, jailed, and thrown, and their business is taken away from them. Now they're all selling alcohol and cigarettes, and now I understand alcoholism is on the rise in the region, somewhat reminiscent of what happens to the reservations and Native Americans. Of course, what's happening to the Uyghurs are, speed. What happened to Native Americans on the speed docket, it's just a dispossessing of their land, the resources, the oil, the gas, and destroying their culture. Now they're in concentration camps, it just nobody knows what goes on behind these horror shows, So I don't see how we can say there's any kind of freedom of religion or culture,
Well, we could spend a long time talking about what we mean by freedom of religion. We saw during the floods in Texas last year, and what's the name of this neighborhood? Olson?
Oh, Lakeview.
Yeah, he wouldn't open his church for people who were homeless. So, how you interpret religion, what boundaries, what's permitted, and in a particular case where religion becomes a base for affirming identity, rights, it will be attacked by the Chinese from every particular angle. So, to the degree that the blacks in China are pushing for rights, they're going to push back hard on them, and they're going to shut down any organization they have that they perceive as challenging whatever the policy is. So in this case, the long-term intent of Chinese ethnic policy is to obliterate all ethnic difference that's not had. And they will do it with carrots and with sticks. That is a long-term goal. So in this case, in some cases, it's a front-on attack. In other cases, it's scholarships, it's political authority within Han ideology. But it's coming from many different directions.
You mentioned that you had an issue with hip hop. I'm an 80s baby, but Wu-Tang Clan particularly talked about Shaolin. I wanted to know, what did you think about the Shaolin monks that were originally black? It was like a lot of research done on them from martial arts.
This is the beauty of art. They're like, to hell with all the boundaries you have. We're going to mix, we're going to match this. A thriving Chinese hip hop. When I say I'm not into hip hop, I grew up culturally where things rhyme and sound.
I mean, I know the mumble rappers of the millennials. But
so I'm talking about more that I realize that the content is what I need to listen for, not the way it's delivered. And that when you listen and you read the words and you go through it, you're like, this stuff is very, very serious. So increasingly, and I'm sure you all are doing that, I integrate popular culture into the work I give the students, because some of them are the opposite. They're just singing. It's like, do you realize what the person is saying?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
That was